In recent weeks, the escalation of the trade war unleashed by Donald Trump has unexpectedly pushed relations between the United States and Europe to a level that even the most skeptical analysts could hardly have imagined until recently. When Trump publicly declared that Europe must pay its bills and agreed to sign an agreement with the European Union obliging Brussels to pay new tariffs into the US budget, the White House saw it as a definitive victory. The American administration presented the situation as if European allies had capitulated under Washington's pressure, and Trump himself did not hide his triumphant rhetoric, boasting that he had broken the Europeans and forced them to comply. However, as the Financial Times reports, citing sources within the European Commission, Brussels understood from the outset that retaliatory tariffs would not be the main weapon. Europe decided to act differently, not with mirror tariffs, but by targeting the most vulnerable points of the American economy, namely the tech giants. According to Politico Europe, as early as July, closed-door meetings in Berlin and Paris discussed a strategy whereby the EU would begin using antitrust and tax legislation to systematically pressure corporations like Google, Apple, Meta, and Amazon. The first steps of this strategy have already become reality. Google received a record fine exceeding 10 billion euros, and according to Le Monde, this is only the beginning. In Brussels, officials openly state that this is not merely a formal legal procedure, but a political signal to Washington. If the White House continues to play with tariffs, Europe will strangle American business on its territory. Moreover, as Der Spiegel reports, citing diplomatic sources in Brussels, an extreme scenario is even being discussed: restricting or suspending the operations of the largest American IT companies in the European market. For Silicon Valley corporations, this would be a catastrophe, as the European audience and advertising budgets account for up to a third of their global revenue. Bloomberg analysts have already calculated that even partial restrictions on Google and Meta's access to the EU market would reduce their market capitalization by hundreds of billions of dollars, seriously impacting the US stock market, where these companies form the core of the Nasdaq index. Brussels understands this and uses it as leverage. At the same time, European officials act very carefully, avoiding rhetoric of open confrontation. Official statements emphasize the need for fair rules of the game and protection of European consumers. But behind the scenes, as Politico writes, key negotiators acknowledge that this is a deliberate punishment of the American administration. An insider in the European Commission told journalists on condition of anonymity, if Trump thought Europe would surrender, he was deeply mistaken. We will not play on the field of tariffs. We will play on the field of regulation, and there Washington is vulnerable. Economists at Nikkei note that Europe's strategy poses a particular threat right now, as American tech giants are under pressure domestically. Congress is discussing antitrust measures. Stock prices are constantly under investor pressure, and global competition with China is intensifying. Now, with Europe threatening to cut off the lifeblood of the largest US corporations, the White House finds itself in a position where the blow is not hitting abstract tariffs on steel or cars, but the very heart of America's economy of the future. Moreover, a consensus long absent is forming within Europe itself. France and Germany, previously divided on energy dependence on the US, are now presenting a united front, and according to Die Welt, even the usually cautious Nordic countries are ready to join the initiative. The political backdrop also works against Washington. European media openly write that the era of vassal dependence on the US is coming to an end, and the new round of Trump's trade war only accelerates this process. Insiders in Brussels say this marks the beginning of European autonomy, with the European Union demonstrating its ability to defend its interests, even if it means striking a traditional ally. In Washington, officials still pretend the situation is under control. Yet in private conversations with Financial Times journalists, members of the US administration admit that the scale of European fines on Google and Apple could trigger a real economic crisis in Silicon Valley. If Europe pushes all the way and even talks about blocking services, the shares of the largest corporations could collapse within days. The question is now stark. Either Trump revises his tariff policy, or the United States risks a blow comparable in impact to a domestic financial crisis. All of this shows that Trump's trade war has backfired. He intended to demonstrate toughness and force Europe to pay, But in the end, it is American corporations that are under threat. For the first time in a long while, Europe is not the object of pressure, but an active player, ready to use its market as a weapon. As Le Monde summarizes, if Trump does not change course, America could lose its most important asset, global dominance of tech companies, which has underpinned U.S. economic leadership for decades. What is particularly painful for Washington is that this time the targets are not abstract economic sectors, but specific companies and identifiable executives. In Silicon Valley, panic is spreading. Bloomberg reports that Google and Apple leaders have urgently held closed consultations with lawyers in London and Brussels, trying to gauge the real threat of their services being blocked in the EU. Google's vice president of global policy, according to Politico, even directly appealed to the European Commission for negotiations, warning that European sanctions could destabilize the global economy. But Brussels responds coldly. The rules are the same for everyone, and if America chooses to wage a trade war, its companies will feel the consequences. Hedge funds in New York have already begun massively reducing positions in the tech sector, creating a risk of a NASDAQ crash. One fund manager told the Wall Street Journal, "We never viewed Europe as a serious threat to American business, but now everything has changed. If this crisis continues, it could be worse than Chinese tariffs." Another worrying signal is the reaction of investors from Asia. Nikkei Asia reports that Japanese and South Korean funds are beginning to shift assets from U.S. tech companies to European and Chinese counterparts. This appears to be the start of a long-term trend. Washington weakens its corporations, while competitors gain an opportunity to strengthen their positions. According to Le Monde insiders, this is precisely what Brussels is counting on, creating a new architecture for the global market in which Europe becomes a key arbiter. Within the EU itself, Die Welt reports that politicians are using the crisis to advance the idea of digital sovereignty. A concept that seemed utopian just a few years ago is now becoming a reality. European cloud services are being created, local AI startups are being supported, and the idea of European social networks and search engines is under discussion, all accompanied by strong pressure on American platforms. Insiders in the European Parliament openly state, "We are tired of being a colony of the American internet. It is time to build our own ecosystem." For Trump, this becomes a personal challenge. His rhetoric about a weak Europe now looks entirely unsustainable, as it is Europe itself delivering blows capable of shaking the very foundations of the American economy. And in the White House, according to Politico, this is fully understood. Several presidential advisors have already warned that if dialogue with Brussels does not begin, the crisis could spiral out of control. The problem, however, is that Trump himself is unwilling to back down. His re-election strategy relies on the image of a tough leader, and any softening of policy toward Europe would be perceived by his electorate as weakness. As a result, the conflict continues by inertia, and more experts are comparing it to the beginning of a Cold War, only now in the digital realm. The Financial Times summed it up in a recent piece. Whereas the 21st century was once predicted to be the arena of US-China competition, Europe is now asserting itself ever more loudly on this stage, and it is precisely Trump's mistakes that have enabled this.